without further ado, in our Soul Path community class this beautiful Friday, we will discuss embracing retrograde energies. So, the first thing, we're going to be talking about fear a little bit. Should you be afraid? Because if you are following any social media accounts on the internet, you're going to see these, intense blasts regularly. Oh my God, it's Mercury retrograde. Oh my God, stop everything. It's Venus retrograde. What's going to happen to your relationships? It's Mars retrograde. You're not going to be able to get anything done. Oh, did you notice all the outer planets are retrograde half the year, pretty much the summer? Some of them start May, June, some of them in the summer. Sometimes there's laggards that start their retrograde in the fall and go through to January or February. But generally, we only have a couple of months, maybe 2, 3 months, maybe February, March, April, where there are no retrogrades for a very brief period. And that doesn't even always happen because sometimes there's also a Mercury retrograde. One of the more, internal personal planets is retrograde. And then, of course, there's the issue of shadow periods, which that has become more known at this point in time also. So, it's not just during the retrograde, people start to freak out. Oh, it's the shadow period of the upcoming retrograde. And then after the retrograde is over, it's like now there's another shadow period. And, with something like Mercury, we're talking 9 weeks altogether, shadow, retrograde, shadow at 3 times a year. If you do the math on that, 27 weeks, that's basically half the year. Mercury retrograde is either retrograde or it's in shadow period. And so the question is, are we supposed to stop life, not make decisions, not sign contracts, not do anything? No. Is that the way we want to live our life? No. So to be clear, just in case someone doesn't really understand the shadow period, it starts at the point that the planet will retrograde back to. So we see here, this line is the actual retrograde. So we're going to start the shadow period here, and all these weeks, so let's just use Mercury because it's 3 weeks and that's simple. So we've got about 3 weeks, and sometimes Mercury goes a little faster, a little slower, so it's not always exact. But we have this period of time when it's moving forward. And of course, it's this getting point to the station where it appears to stop in the sky. And first it's just moving very slowly, and then it appears to stop. That is called the station. Then it stations retrograde, goes all the way back to the starting point of the shadow, goes direct, but we can't be happy yet. We have to know that we got to go all the way through until it gets to the point where the retrograde started. And then we are free and clear to move on to life, to move on to basically the next retrograde planet. So my question for everybody is, when you're listening to this, is can we just breathe and be in retrograde periods consciously? Can we use what they're here for? Because the fear of the retrogrades is limiting for us. It limits our sense of empowerment, our free will, our consciousness. If we feel like this retrograde motion is so strong and so negative that we can't do anything, ultimately for most of the year, every single year, then we're taking what could be a beautiful set of knowledge and a philosophy to help us live life consciously, an ongoing weather report that will allow us to do what's required in every moment. And instead of that, we just kind of close down and wait for it to be over. And then that's when people first learn about retrogrades, that's a lot of what they imagine needs to happen. I wanted to look for a job, but I'm going to wait for the retrograde to be over. I wanted to buy a house, but I'm going to wait. So there's all this waiting until, it's all systems clear. And there are certainly many situations where we really just can't do that. I remember years ago, I had a client who was in sales, so his, jobs changed somewhat regularly, and he always was looking for a job when the Mercury especially was moving forward. But when he would get the job offer, Mercury was always retrograde every time. And, he had to decide whether he wanted to, supposedly take that risk, sign a contract, and move forward. And he did have some very good jobs. Things went fine for him. But, the retrograde energy was always in the back of his mind. Now, we can look at retrogrades on two levels, and we will today. One is natal. Are you born with planets retrograde? What does that mean? And what do you do when planets are in a retrograde phase in your chart? How can you work with this energy consciously and co-creatively? And then the third part is, what about progressions? So progressions are the way that we track the slow integration of planetary energy by tracking each day after birth as if it takes us a year to evolve through that energy. So basically, 90 days after birth corresponds with 90 years after birth. That means that the progressed sun is moving at the rate of 1 degree per year, because usually it's 1 degree per day, basically about, the sun moves through signs every month. So imagine that you're born with or you're born with retrograde planets, and then they progress direct. What does that mean? There's deep changes that you're experiencing when that happens. And I'm trying to consider for a moment how much I want to go into this. Yeah, let's just slow it down here and talk about each one of these pieces. So, what does it mean if you're born with a retrograde planet? And people have written whole books about it. So, if you're interested in this and you have a lot of retrograde planets, it may be worthwhile for you to read some of those books and ponder very, very deeply what we're going to go through in an hour today. But if you're born with a retrograde planet, my fundamental interpretation of every single one is that you have an agenda as a soul to work with that planetary energy in a personal, unique, soul-centered way. You are learning something important about that planet. It is a significant part of your soul's path. And you want to understand the planet from this personal, authentic place, and not via your family imprinting and your cultural imprinting, working with the planet the way everybody else is. You want to understand and maybe even think of it as healing something about that planet's operation. So the planet in your natal chart is going to be retrograde for your whole life. Just in the natal chart, it'll always show up with an R next to it, or in some software, it's red. The numbers around it that show what degrees it's at, it will be red to show you that it's retrograde. And then when it stations direct at some point in your life, which sometimes that won't happen. Like if you're born with Pluto retrograde or Uranus, Neptune, ones that are retrograde for months, and you're born at the beginning of that time, then you won't live long enough to see it go direct by progression. So you just like your whole life, you are working with it from that perspective of review, of retracing your steps, of understanding the past lives that you have experienced with that planet. And that's just the way that it is. Now, but let's say you were born when the planet was about to move direct, and let's say in 5 degrees. And then over time, that 5 degrees, moves forward by progression. And you get to the point that the planet is now progressed direct. Now it's like, oh, you finished that deep dive you did. You finished the PhD in that planet. And now you have a body of knowledge and wisdom inside you, and you are taking that forward into the world. And if potentially that progressed planet gets to where it was when you were born, so, it kept on by progression, retrograding, and then it went forward and now it's caught back up with where it started, that is a hugely important time because now you can take the energy of that planet a whole extra direction forward in life. You're here to do something with it in maybe a bigger way than you ever like felt the confidence or the security about all of the energies inherent in that planet. So those progressed changes, watching that, and I would encourage each one of you to get an ephemeris. And they have ephemeris pages. Ephemeris is the listing of all of the planets and where they are every day. On astro.com, they have ephemeris, and you can go back to the year and the month of when you were born, and you can just look 90 days, 3 months after that, and just track if there are times when any planet uh, goes direct or goes retrograde during the course of your life. And you can simply count from, birth time, let's say 6 days after you were born, a retrograde planet goes direct. Well, that means that when you're 6 years old, that happened already. But maybe there's another planet that goes retrograde when you're 42 and stays retrograde for your whole life. So examples of this are for me, like I was tracking by progression Mars, which is in my 9th house of higher learning, teaching, foreign travel. It's the ruling planet of my chart. It looked like it was coming to the midheaven, and I was imagining something strong and pioneering and new happening for me when it came into the 10th house of career. And then it went retrograde like a couple of decades ago, really. And it will stay in my 9th house for my whole life. So instead of wondering like what Mars might bring in the place of career, I know that I am doing a deep dive with Mars energy, what I'm pioneering, what I'm bringing forward from the place of teaching and writing and publishing and being in the world. It's a different flavor than the 10th house. Uh, at the same time, I was born with Pluto retrograde, and I've had that experience that I mentioned where it progressed retrograde for a while, but then it went direct, and it has now caught up with my natal Pluto and gone beyond. And that is allowing, I think, a much greater use of my Pluto power in the area of creative expression. Now, retrograde transits. And what I, mean by this, of course, is that what we were talking about, that, a planet in the sky seems to be going retrograde. And that has to do with the relative speed of the planets and the Earth as they're going around the sun. And I'm not a great astronomy master, but one of the ways it's been explained to me is when you're side by side another car, and the other car is going a different speed than you are, especially when it's slow. So you're noticing that it will feel like you're going backward or they're going backward, even though neither one of you is. It's just this speed thing is uneven. So when that is happening and you're having a retrograde of any planet in a sign, in a house in your chart, this is giving you an indication that there is something you're having to review and revisit in connection with the affairs of that house, all the different things. Every house represents the psyche, the consciousness, and how it conceives of a particular area of life. And how we conceive of an area of life. Remember, you had that chart the moment you were born. So it was before you met your parents or had all your childhood experiences. That conception of area of lives is intrinsic to your soul. And you therefore create events and structures out of what you believe about a place. So, first house, self, your body, the way that you look, the way that you walk into a room. Fourth house, literally house, home, family, the people that you call your family from birth or the ones you constellate around you. Fifth house, the area of creative expression. We know all these house parts of life, and then they are affected by the sign that is in that house. So when the planet is transiting retrograde in that place, you have this spotlight on that area. And as the planet had first been moving forward, you thought you were going somewhere, doing something. The planet was operating, it was touching certain planets maybe that are in that house, or forming aspects to planets that are not in the house. And now it goes back and it's like it's redoing everything. And you'll find that in the retrograde phase, what you cared about or thought you were doing, the plans you had, may suddenly fall apart, or you may simply choose to reconsider them. So maybe you thought you wanted to leave your job, but now there's a retrograde and you're not so sure anymore. Maybe it's a Venus retrograde, and you start to realize that you really love your coworkers and you don't want to leave them. Or Venus retrograde money. It's maybe you start to feel you've got some potential for more money there, and you'd like to stay a little longer and do that. So instead of jumping and leaving, and Venus making connections with people that might give you an in on a job, you slow things down and you reconsider. Now, here's today's chart, the transits of the moment when we started the class. And you can see that the moon has just barely moved into Aquarius. It was in Capricorn the last few days, and touched into Pluto. Maybe that's why I was so tired this morning. Gosh, I just didn't want to wake up at all. But you can see that here we have Saturn at 13 degrees, 42 minutes of Pisces, red. So we know Saturn is retrograde. Neptune at 27:57, red, retrograde. Chiron, 21:21, retrograde. Uranus, 26:37, retrograde. And Jupiter. Jupiter just went retrograde, 21:19. And going all the way around. And Pluto is retrograde, 29:38. Now, Pluto is actually going to go direct today, this afternoon in Pacific time. So it is completely stationed. It's moving into Aquarius today and will be there fully for 20 years. And I think we're all going to applaud and go, yay, because this Pluto in Capricorn since 2008 has been a bear. It has been exposing corruptions left, right, and center, digging deep, having us all go deep into our collective psyche about what kind of structure we want to build in the world. It could be possible that some of these inner planets like Mars, Mercury, Venus could be retrograde, but at this point in time they are not. But we are having a Mars retrograde period this next few months. So Mars, which normally spends about 2 months in a sign, will spend 5 months, which it does when it's retrograde. And so we get a lot more time to work with it. I can still remember the time many, many years ago when my children were little and I was a single mom, and Mars went retrograde in my fifth house of children. And it was as if somebody had sent those little boys an agenda to be angry, willful, difficult, fight with each other. I mean, it was a stress and a struggle for sure during that whole phase, whether Mars was direct or retrograde. But again, sort of coming into what we're talking about here, knowing that I was in a retrograde phase at that point with children and with the energies of Mars and how I handled my own Mars energy was really important to get through that phase. You know, they're operating out of the dream of my chart. You know, like I said, it's not in their chart. It was in my chart that my children would be more Mars-like for this extended period of time. So we're going to go through the planets here and think about what they do and therefore what their retrograde phase is like, whether it is in your natal chart or it is a transit that you're dealing with. Now I'm starting with the sun. The sun doesn't go retrograde because this whole thing is about all of the planets going around the sun, basically. So I just want to make sure everybody's clear on that. The sun is about our personal power and vitality. It is always just there as the sun. And it is the fact that this path around the sun and the apparent backward motion is, why we have retrogrades. And the moon is traveling around us, and there's no retrogrades with the moon either. And the moon, of course, is our emotional security and how we nurture and how we connect to unconditional love. So what we call the two lights, sun and moon, are never retrograde. And the ascendant or rising sign is a position that relates to what was rising over the horizon when we were born. So it's not going retrograde either. But it's important to consider if you have a retrograde planet that aspects the ascendant. Because if you do, then it may be more difficult for you to move your plans forward, approaching life, new ventures, new starts, first impressions, like all of these things you may feel more reluctant about. You may feel more held back. You may imagine you're going to be blocked. You may have to do extra work around the details to move things forward. So that's something to consider, is to look at planets that strongly aspect your ascendant. Usually, if you have planets that are in trine or sextile to the ascendant, they help you move things forward. If you have planets that square or other hard aspects to the ascendant, then that will tend to slow you down some. If the planet is also retrograde, it's another level of, you have to review. Maybe somebody else wakes up one morning and says, I think I'm going to teach an astrology class on retrograde planets, and then they just do it. And somebody else wakes up and thinks, I want to teach a class on retrograde planets, and I better research this and think about it and find out everything I need to find out, and I'll be able to teach that class in 6 months. That's a little bit of what will happen when retrogrades affect your movement forward through the ascendant. Now, here we come to the most famous of all potential retrogrades, which is Mercury. So remember that Mercury represents our capacity for communication, the way we process data and work with our rational mind, everything about talking, teaching, writing, speaking, listening, reading, observing, all of those mental processes that we do in life, and not necessarily relate to our actual intelligence. We can have people with Mercury in a sign who are all levels of intelligence, but the style of the intelligence will relate to the sign that your natal Mercury is in. If you're born with Mercury retrograde, then we would say that you are a person who has to check out details and is learning about communication in a way that is unique to you, disconnected from your family imprinting. And so much about early communication comes from the family and how they speak to you, what books they read to you, whether there's stimulation in your environment. So whatever's going on in your environment, you are attuned to something else. Now remember, since Mercury is only retrograde for 3 weeks, approximately 21 days, then that means that the most it could be retrograde in your natal chart by progression will be 21 years. So sometime between birth and 21, if you were born with Mercury retrograde, it is going to progress direct and you will be finished that learning phase. On the other hand, if you're born with Mercury direct, and sometime in your life it goes retrograde by progression, you will enter a 21-year period then where you are then learning about the mind and communication and processing of information in your own unique way. Sometimes when Mercury goes retrograde, a person discovers that they have learning disabilities, or like dyslexia or ADHD, something like that is happening that they understand and they can work with healing that. By the same token, being born with Mercury retrograde may mean that you are processing things differently. And when it goes direct, you have cracked the code and you can figure out, how to operate with your unique mindset. Now, when Mercury is retrograde by transit, as I said, 3 times a year, this is a time period to do all the things, all the words that start with RE. So review, reconsider, revisit, replenish, restore. You could probably think of 10 more words. And it is a time to be a little bit more careful about documents and things like that. It does seem that we're a little more prone to make errors, but and some people would say don't sign a contract, but quite often we have no choice but to sign a contract. But if you have to make plans with Mercury retrograde, it's a good idea to have like insurance, like if say you book a trip, that you have trip cancellation insurance. If you have to commit to a contract for a job or to buy a house or something like that, be extra careful. Because it is only 3 weeks, you can often put a clause in there to revisit, like buying a house. You've got what your period of time is to release the contingencies. If you can set that after Mercury goes direct, that can be a secure feeling. But overall, I really don't believe that we're supposed to stop life when Mercury is retrograde. And in fact, since we know that many times things break when Mercury's in retrograde, our computer, our phones, other equipment, our TV, that quite often we're in a situation where we must buy something new to replace something. So again, I'd get a warranty more likely when Mercury's retrograde, but I'm not going to stress about it because the Mercury retrograde actually shows us what needs to be replaced, shows us what needs to be fixed. And many times errors that we've created in past times come to light with Mercury because we are reconsidering and reviewing things energetically, even if we don't know we're doing that. So we'll find errors and correct them when Mercury is retrograde. Venus, which I've mentioned already, that capacity to attract and maintain relationships and resources. When Venus is retrograde, I think one of the number one things I see is that relationships from the past show up again. People track you down on Facebook or Instagram. They want to reconnect. Maybe it's just a friendship. Maybe it's an old relationship that's more of a romantic nature. They want to see how you're doing. You might run into people that you haven't seen for a really long time. And on the resource level, this is a great time to review your skills, your resources, the money you have, how you're spending it, how you're taking care of your possessions. Maybe you want to beautify them, fix things that really should have been fixed a long time ago. So that's a great use of the Venus retrograde to consider who your friends are. Uh, you know, like, do you want to cultivate and focus on your friends? These days, life moves so fast. If we don't have a focus on our friends and make a point to see them, months and months can go by where we neglect key relationships. So, Venus retrograde is a time to review the important people in our life and make a commitment to cultivating the relationships more deeply. And Mars. So we know Mars is about will and desire and our competitive nature, the way that we start things and make things happen. And to have Mars in a retrograde can feel frustrating, a little irritating. We're slowed down, but we need to be slowed down. I mean, if Mars was allowed to just go, go, go endlessly, we would keep starting things and we might never finish them, or we might start things that we haven't considered fully. So we would need our Mars retrograde to take a step back and consider what actually matters to us. Where do we wish to put our resources? How do we want to move forward in a way that uses that vibrant, powerful life force energy of Mars, but we're not burning ourselves out? So, be attuned to that in this upcoming Mars cycle. And maybe if we have some time to look at charts today, we'll look at where the Mars retrograde is going to be in a few charts. That might be a fun thing to do. Jupiter, the search for the meaning of life, the development of our beliefs and philosophies, faith and confidence. With Jupiter, we expand, we keep going, bigger and bigger, and sometimes can be overly optimistic. In Jupiter's retrograde phase, we have to pull back and reconsider, is our life in alignment with our actual beliefs and philosophies? We take in so much from the media, people around us. We're being affected all the time around what our beliefs are. And if we study something and we're in a spiritual practice, then even more our Jupiterian energies are being changed all the time. So Jupiter retrograde gives us a time to not keep expanding and growing bigger, but to come back in to core and develop faith, optimism, and confidence in a very authentic way so that as we move forward in our next phase, we're lined up. Saturn, accomplishment, mastery, success, the development of all the self-discipline, self-respect, excellent, this persevering part of ourselves that has a karmic mission. We really need this retrograde phase. We're working and working and working, and we need that time period every year where we pull back a little bit and we take care of some of the structural details that maybe aren't quite as solid, quite as excellent, quite as in alignment with our greatest soul's purpose for that great work that we are creating. And I know, when I say that mastery, accomplishment, great work, some of you may feel like your life is more ordinary and, you're not building anything, but we're all building something. We may be building a family. We may be building a relationship with our cat. We may be just a good friend. We may be, caring about the political world. Our Saturn is taking us where we need to be. And when it's retrograde, we often can feel like we're slowed down from moving to goals and objectives. And yet Saturn is always demanding that we do the deepest, deepest work and we leave no stone unturned. And the retrograde phase is when we are to do that. Neptune representing, the seeking of bliss and oneness, the dissolution of the ego, the transcendent creativity. We reach out for that high frequency experience one way or another, sometimes in, more addictive, dependent ways, but sometimes in clear spiritual ways. And as we go into the retrograde of this one, it just slows that process down. Coming back to if you're born with these planets, if you're born with Neptune retrograde, you are here to evolve your spirituality in your soul-centered, unique way, and not necessarily in the same way as your family and the cultural beliefs you were born into. Since this is retrograde half the year, we can see that the potential for half of us to not embrace Christianity or Judaism, which most of us here in the Western world were exposed to as children, but we have to find something else, which many of us define as spiritual, not religious, Buddhist, Hindu, yoga oriented. There's many ways that we find Neptune. Some of us find Neptune by being in nature and, having solo journeys where we feel that oneness and that fabric of existence. Uranus, another spiritual planet, the urge for awakening and enlightenment, at least our authentic individuality. We need that to slow down sometimes because we can feel as it's moving forward, we can feel like we're being shaken around and things are happening fast. We're having maybe some difficulty making decisions that will break us from our stuck places into being unstuck, and having this period of time to review what is authentic, what is awakening for us, allows us to just do exactly that, to break free. And finally, on the planetary level, Pluto, the urge for evolutionary transformation, connecting into our destiny and alignment with our generational tribe. Well, Pluto is already taking us deep into the psyche, into the subconscious, the shadow material. Then it goes retrograde. We review what we've just done. We go deeper into that transformation. Then it goes forward. Sometimes there are 5 direct hits on a particular planet or on the ascendant. And if you've been through that, you know what that's like. It's like Pluto is this steamroller, and we can resist it, or we can lean in and go with it and keep looking for what is hidden. What are the unconscious motivations that are driving us to have events that we'd rather not have? When we fully embrace the Plutonian energies and we feel all those feelings, and we especially feel the fears that limit us from our highest expression, then our lives start to move in alignment with the destiny, with the path. So, and again, this is one of these outer ones that natally is retrograde for many, many people. So if you've got Pluto retrograde, you are doing a deep dive to transform yourself in this life. Now, the lunar nodes are interesting because they are fundamentally retrograde most of the time. They move backward from our perspective in the sky. And the south node um, uh, represents our past and the gifts we're bringing in, but also the um, habit patterns that harm us, difficult. And then the north node represents the goal state and the blockages and fears we have. Now, if you use the true nodes, some people will have retrograde nodes, and some, very few people, will have direct nodes because it wobbles, it goes back and forth. If you use the mean nodes, which is what Stephen Forrest recommends, I use the true. I find that more accurate. But if you use the mean nodes, then they've been averaged out and it's just always moving backwards. So, in summary, relax and connect consciously with all phases. That's all you have to do. You can know that you're born with a review in your soul's mind. You can know that every year planets are going retrograde and you have to shift your perspective to operate in alignment with what's happening. But there's no need for fear. And my next big talks are coming up in February with the Connecticut Astrological Society. Seems like I have a couple of months here with no prep work to do for a talk other than our Friday events. And let's maybe take a look at a couple of charts about this. I'm not sure where the timing is. And we'll stop the share.